The bullet had grazed so close to Jackson Fuller's hat that he could still smell the gunpowder. And now he found himself riding hard through the Arizona Territory wilderness with no clear destination except away. It was June of 1883, and the sun beat down mercilessly on the desert landscape as his horse, a sturdy chestnut mare named Daisy, picked her way through the rocky terrain south of Prescott. Jackson had been riding for 3 days since leaving town after a card game went sideways, and though he hadn't started the fight, he'd been smart enough to leave before the marshal started asking questions he didn't want to answer. The landscape changed as he rode deeper into the canyon country, red rocks rising up like ancient sentinels guarding secrets that predated any white man's arrival. Jackson was 26 years old, tall and lean from years of hard work on cattle drives, with dark hair that hung a bit too long beneath his worn Stetson, and eyes the color of creek water in spring. He'd been cowboying since he was 14, and in those 12 years, he'd seen most of what the West had to offer, both beautiful and brutal. As the afternoon wore on, Jackson noticed storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The temperature dropped suddenly, and he knew he needed shelter. Desert storms could be fierce and dangerous, with flash floods that could sweep a man and horse away in seconds. He guided Daisy toward a cluster of rock formations that looked promising, hoping to find an overhang or shallow cave where they could wait out the weather. The first drops of rain were fat and heavy, kicking up small puffs of dust where they landed. Jackson dismounted and led Daisy toward what appeared to be a dark opening in the rock face, partially hidden by scrub brush and a twisted juniper tree. Thunder rumbled overhead as he pushed through the brush, and that's when he saw the boot prints in the soft dirt near the cave entrance. Fresh prints, small ones, not more than a day or two old. Every instinct told him to be cautious. Out here, you couldn't be too careful about who or what you might encounter. Could be bandits using the cave as a hideout, or maybe a wounded animal had taken shelter. Jackson pulled his rifle from its saddle scabbard and called out, "Anyone in there? I'm just looking for shelter from the storm." "Don't mean any harm." Silence answered him, broken only by the increasing patter of rain on rock. Jackson waited, giving whoever might be inside a chance to respond. When no answer came, he took a careful step into the cave entrance, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness. The cave was deeper than he'd expected, the entrance opening into a larger chamber. As his vision cleared, he saw signs of habitation. A small fire pit with cold ashes, a stack of firewood neatly arranged against one wall, and what looked like bedding made from animal hides and dried grass. "I know someone's here," Jackson said, keeping his voice calm and even. "I can see you've been living here. Like I said, I just need shelter from the storm. I'll stay by the entrance, won't bother you none." Another long moment of silence, and then a voice emerged from the deeper shadows, thin and wary like a wild creature unsure whether to flee or fight. "Put the rifle down first. Set it outside the cave." Jackson's eyebrows rose. The voice was feminine, young, and carried the cultured tones of education, not what he'd expected to hear in a cave in the middle of nowhere, Arizona. "Madam, I'd be happy to do that, but I'd feel a mite easier if you'd step into the light where I can see you. Fair's fair. You're on my property. You don't get to make demands." "This cave belongs to you?" Jackson asked, finding himself almost amused despite the strangeness of the situation. "It does now. I've been here 2 years. That makes it mine." 2 years. Jackson processed that information, his mind racing with questions. What would make a woman live alone in a cave for 2 years? He slowly lowered the rifle, pointing it at the ground. "All right, I'm setting the rifle down, see?" He placed it carefully on the ground near the entrance. "My name's Jackson Fuller. I'm a cowhand, just passing through. Got into a bit of trouble in Prescott. Nothing serious, but thought it best to make myself scarce for a spell. The silence stretched so long he thought she might not respond, but then he heard the soft shuffle of movement. A figure emerged from the shadows, and Jackson found himself looking at a woman who might have been anywhere from 20 to 30, though he guessed closer to the younger end of that range. She was painfully thin, her dress patched and faded, but clean. Her hair hung in a long braid over one shoulder, dark blonde and streaked lighter by the sun. But it was her eyes that caught him, pale blue and watchful, like a hawk's eyes, missing nothing. In her hands, she held a pistol, old but well-maintained, and she held it with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it. "Rebecca Sawyer," she said after a moment, as if deciding that basic courtesy required an introduction. "And I meant what I said about this being my place. The storm will pass in an hour or two. You can wait it out, then you need to move on." "Yes, madam, I understand," Jackson said, keeping his hands visible and his movements slow. "Appreciate the hospitality." Rebecca's lips pressed into a thin line that might have been suppressing a bitter smile. "Wouldn't call it hospitality exactly. More like I don't want to shoot a man for wanting to stay dry." She gestured with the pistol toward the entrance. "Keep to that side. Don't come any deeper into the cave." Jackson nodded and settled himself near the entrance, watching as Rebecca retreated back into the shadows, though he could still see her outline, still see the glint of the gun in her hand. Outside, the storm arrived in full force, rain sheeting down in curtains, lightning splitting the sky with brilliant cracks of light. Daisy had taken shelter near the cave entrance, standing patiently with her head down. As his eyes adjusted further, Jackson could see more details of Rebecca's living space. She'd been resourceful, that much was clear. There were woven baskets that looked like Apache work, probably traded for or found. A water container made from a hollowed gourd sat near the back wall. Dried herbs hung from natural protrusions in the rock, and he could see what looked like strips of dried meat, probably rabbit or deer. "You really been here 2 years?" Jackson asked, breaking the silence. "Going on 26 months, Rebecca replied, her voice still wary but perhaps slightly less hostile than before. "That's a long time to be alone." "That's the point." Jackson waited, hoping she might elaborate, but she didn't. He tried a different approach. "You do all this yourself?" "The setup here, I mean, it's right impressive. Didn't have much choice. Learn or die, those were my options." "What made you choose a cave over a town?" Jackson asked, genuinely curious now. "Seems like a hard way to live when there's civilization not too far off." Rebecca was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat, emotionless in a way that suggested she'd practiced telling herself this story without feeling. "I'm hiding. From my husband." "Former husband, I should say, though the law wouldn't see it that way." "He hurt you?" Jackson asked, his voice hardening. "He killed my sister," Rebecca said simply. "She was visiting us in Tucson. He came home drunk, thought she was me, shot her before either of us could even scream. When he realized what he'd done, he tried to blame it on bandits, but I saw him do it." Jackson felt his chest tighten with anger and sorrow. And the law believed him. Marcus Sawyer was well-connected, wealthy, charming when he needed to be. "I was his wife, and a wife's testimony against her husband wasn't worth much. They called me hysterical, grief-stricken, confused. One marshal even suggested I was trying to escape my wifely duties by making up stories." The bitterness in her voice could have stripped paint. "So I ran. Took what I could carry and disappeared. I figured he'd look for me in towns, cities, anywhere civilized. I figured a cave in the middle of nowhere was the last place anyone would think to search." And you've been here ever since. Ever since. I go to small settlements sometimes, trade herbs and basket work for supplies. Never the same place twice in a row, never anywhere close to here. I'm careful. The rain continued to pound down, and Jackson found himself studying this woman who'd chosen survival in a cave over the dangers of civilization. She had courage, that much was certain, and she'd clearly learned skills that most society ladies would never need. "Your sister," he said quietly. What was her name? Rebecca's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Ruth. She was 19, 3 years younger than me. She wanted to be a teacher. She would have been good at it too. "I'm sorry," Jackson said and meant it. "Everyone's sorry. Sorry doesn't bring her back." They fell into silence again, but it felt less hostile now, more like two people sharing space while the world raged outside. Jackson watched the storm, watched the way the lightning illuminated the desert in stark flashes of white. He thought about his own life, the way he'd been drifting from one job to another, one town to the next, never putting down roots because he'd never seen the point. His parents were long dead, killed in a Comanche raid when he was 12. He'd been raised by various ranch families after that, learning to cowboy, learning to survive, but never really learning how to build a life. After about an hour, the storm began to ease. The thunder moved off into the distance, and the rain lessened to a steady drizzle. Jackson knew he should probably mount up and ride on, find somewhere else to camp for the night. But something kept him sitting there, watching this woman who'd made a home in stone and shadow. "You got enough food?" he asked suddenly. Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "Why?" "Just wondering." "I got some supplies in my saddlebags. Coffee, beans, some hardtack. Nothing fancy, but you're welcome to it if you need it." "I don't need charity." Wasn't offering charity. Was offering to share supplies with someone who gave me shelter from the storm. There's a difference. Rebecca seemed to consider this. "What do you want in return?" "Nothing," Jackson said honestly. "Well, maybe conversation. Been riding alone for 3 days. Gets lonely." "I've been alone for 2 years. You get used to it." "Do you really, though?" The question seemed to catch Rebecca off guard. Her fingers tightened on the pistol, then slowly relaxed. "No," she admitted quietly. "You don't. But it's safer than the alternative." Jackson stood slowly, moving toward the cave entrance where his horse waited. "I'm just going to get those supplies from my saddlebags," he explained, keeping his movements obvious and unthreatening. Rebecca watched him like a hawk, the pistol still ready but no longer quite so aggressively pointed in his direction. He retrieved a burlap sack from Daisy's saddle and brought it back into the cave, setting it on the ground between them. "There's coffee, beans, some salt pork, dried apples, and a small sack of sugar. Take whatever you want." Rebecca stared at the bag as if it might contain a snake. "Why are you being kind to me? You don't know me." "Don't need to know someone to be decent to them," Jackson said. "Though I reckon I know enough. I know you're brave. I know you've survived something terrible. I know you're making the best of a hard situation. That's more than I know about most folks." For the first time, something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched Rebecca's lips. "You talk pretty for a cowboy." "My mother was a school teacher before she married my father. She insisted I learn to read and write properly. Said there was no excuse for ignorance when there were books in the world." "Was?" Rebecca asked, catching the past tense. "They died when I was 12. Comanche raid on our homestead in West Texas. I was out checking the fence line, came back to find them both gone." Rebecca's expression softened with understanding that only came from shared grief. "So we're both running from ghosts." "I suppose we are," Jackson agreed. "Though mine are 14 years dead. Seems like yours are more recent and more dangerous." The rain had stopped completely now, leaving the desert smelling of wet earth and creosote bush. The sun was low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Jackson should leave, should mount up and ride on before full dark. But something in Rebecca's face, a loneliness that mirrored his own, made him hesitate. "I could stay tonight," he offered carefully. "Sleep outside the cave entrance, keep watch, then head out in the morning." "Why would you do that?" "Because you've been alone for 2 years, and sometimes it's nice to know there's someone between you and the world, even if it's just for one night." Rebecca studied him for a long moment, and Jackson had the feeling he was being weighed and measured against some internal standard only she knew. Finally, she nodded. "All right, but you stay outside the cave, and I'm keeping the gun." "Wouldn't expect otherwise," Jackson said. He made camp just outside the cave entrance, building a small fire from the dry wood he found under a rock overhang. The wood must have been Rebecca's collection, and he made a mental note to replace what he used before he left. As darkness fell, he cooked beans and salt pork, the smell rich and savory in the clean desert air. To his surprise, Rebecca emerged from the cave, still carrying the pistol but looking slightly less ready to use it. She'd brought 2 battered tin plates and cups. "If you're cooking, might as well share it properly," she said. They ate in comfortable silence at first, sitting on opposite sides of the fire. Jackson noticed how Rebecca ate slowly, savoring each bite, and realized that, despite her resourcefulness, fresh food must be a rarity for her. He made coffee strong and bitter, sweetened slightly with the sugar he'd brought. "Tell me about the world," Rebecca said suddenly. "What's happening out there? I haven't heard news in months," so Jackson told her. He talked about the railroad expansion, about new settlements springing up across the territory. He told her about the ongoing conflicts with the Apache, about Geronimo's resistance and the Army's pursuit. He mentioned the growing cattle industry, the drought that had hit West Texas hard last year, the silver strikes in Tombstone. He talked until his voice grew hoarse, and Rebecca listened with an intensity that suggested she was starving for connection with the world she'd left behind. "Do you ever think about going back?" Jackson asked when he'd run out of news to share. "To civilization, I mean." "Every day," Rebecca admitted, "and every day I decide to stay alive instead. What if your husband stopped looking? What if he gave up, figured you were dead?" "Marcus doesn't give up. It's not in his nature. And even if he did, he'd have told people I was crazy, dangerous maybe. I couldn't go back to Tucson, couldn't use my real name. I'd be starting over with nothing, and the risk of being recognized would always be there." "There's more to the world than Tucson," Jackson pointed out. "You could go to California, or north to Colorado. Hell, you could go east if you wanted. With what money? What skills? I can identify medicinal herbs and weave baskets, Jackson." "That's not exactly going to set me up for a new life in San Francisco." "You're smart, educated. You could teach, like your sister wanted to do." Rebecca shook her head. "Teaching requires references, a background check. Any formal employment would create a trail. Marcus has money and resources. He could find me if I left even a small trail." Jackson poked at the fire, watching sparks spiral up into the star-filled sky. "Seems like a waste is all, you hiding away in a cave when you could be living." "I am living," Rebecca said, but there was doubt in her voice now. "Are you?" Jackson challenged gently. "Or are you just surviving? There's a difference." They talked long into the night, sharing stories and sorrows, and Jackson found himself drawn to this woman who'd chosen strength over surrender. Rebecca was sharp-witted and well-read, and despite 2 years of isolation, she hadn't lost her ability to engage in conversation or debate. She challenged his opinions, made him laugh with dry observations about his traveling stories, and gradually, as the hours passed, the pistol went from being held ready to resting in her lap. When Jackson finally bedded down near the fire, he heard Rebecca retreat back into the cave. But before he fell asleep, he heard her voice drift out from the darkness. "Thank you, Jackson, for the food and the conversation. You're welcome, Rebecca. Sleep well." Morning came with the harsh clarity of desert sunlight. Jackson woke to find Rebecca already up, tending a small fire and heating water for coffee. She looked different in the daylight, less like a wild creature and more like a woman making the best of difficult circumstances. Her hair was neatly braided again, and she'd washed her face and hands. "Morning," Jackson said, sitting up and rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Morning," Rebecca replied, pouring coffee into the tin cups. "I've been thinking about what you said last night." "What part?" "The part about just surviving instead of living." She handed him a cup and sat down on a rock near the fire. "You're right. This isn't living, it's existing, but I don't see another option." Jackson sipped the coffee, thinking carefully about his next words. An idea had been forming in his mind since he'd woken, something probably foolish and certainly complicated, but it wouldn't leave him alone. What if you had protection? Someone between you and Marcus, someone to watch your back while you figured out a new life. Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that I'm between jobs anyway. Was planning to drift until I found the next ranch that needed hands, but I could just as easily drift with a companion. We could head west, maybe up to New Mexico territory, find a town where nobody knows either of us. You could start over, use a different name, and I'd be there if anyone came asking questions." "You don't even know me," Rebecca protested. "Why would you append your life for a stranger?" "Maybe because I know what it's like to be alone," Jackson said honestly. "Maybe because I'm tired of drifting without purpose. Maybe because you deserve better than hiding in a cave for the rest of your life. Or maybe I just believe it's the right thing to do." Rebecca stared into her coffee, her expression unreadable. "That's a lot of maybes. Life's full of maybes. Doesn't mean we shouldn't take chances on them." "And what would you get out of this arrangement?" Rebecca asked, her voice cautious. Jackson shrugged. "Companionship, purpose, a reason to stay in one place for a while. I'm not asking for anything more than that, Rebecca. This wouldn't be like that, wouldn't be what you had before. This would be two people helping each other out, partners of a sort." "Partners," Rebecca repeated, testing the word. "Equal partners. You'd have as much say as me in where we go, what we do. And if you ever wanted to part ways, no hard feelings. I'd make sure you were settled somewhere safe first." Rebecca was quiet for a long time, and Jackson let her think, didn't push. This was a huge decision, he knew that. She'd been surviving on her own terms for 2 years, and what he was offering meant trusting someone again, trusting a man again after what Marcus had done. Finally, Rebecca looked up, meeting his eyes with that hawk-sharp gaze. "If I agree to this, there have to be rules, clear boundaries." "Of course. We travel together, but we sleep separately. You don't touch me without permission. You respect my decisions and my space. Agreed. And if I say it's not working, if I want to stop, you let me go. No arguments, no trying to convince me otherwise. You have my word." Rebecca took a deep breath, and Jackson could see the war going on behind her eyes, fear battling with hope, caution wrestling with the desire for something better. "All right," she said finally. "Let's try this. But we start fresh, new names, new story. As far as anyone knows, we're married and heading west to start a ranch. It'll be easier to explain, less questions." Jackson felt his heart rate pick up, though whether from excitement or nervousness he couldn't quite say. "Makes sense. What names do you want to use?" "You should keep Jackson. It's common enough, won't draw attention. But change your last name, and I'll be Rebecca Ford, your wife of 2 years. "Jackson and Rebecca Ford," Jackson said, trying it out. "All right, we can do this." They spent the morning preparing. Rebecca had less to pack than Jackson had expected. Her life in the cave had been stripped down to bare essentials. She had a change of clothes, a few personal items that had belonged to her sister, her pistol and ammunition, the herbs she'd dried, and several baskets she'd woven. Everything fit into a single large canvas bag that had seen better days. Jackson helped her dismantle the camp she'd built over 2 years, erasing as much evidence of her presence as possible. It seemed important somehow, covering the traces of this chapter of her life. When they were done, the cave looked like nothing more than a natural shelter, the kind any traveler might use for a night. "Ready?" Jackson asked, extending a hand to help Rebecca onto Daisy. Rebecca looked back at the cave one last time, and Jackson saw a mixture of emotions cross her face. Relief, certainly, but also fear and a strange kind of grief. This place had been her prison and her sanctuary, the thing that kept her safe and the thing that kept her from living. "Ready," she said, taking his hand. They rode double on Daisy, Rebecca sitting behind Jackson with her arms wrapped around his waist for balance. It was the closest they'd been to each other, and Jackson could feel the tension in her body, the way she held herself carefully separate despite necessity. He kept Daisy to a steady walk, not wanting to jostle Rebecca any more than necessary, giving her time to adjust. They headed northwest, avoiding main trails and settlements for the first few days. Jackson wanted to put distance between them and the cave before they started interacting with people. They fell into a routine quickly. Jackson would make camp each evening while Rebecca gathered herbs or edible plants. They'd cook together, eat together, talk about their plans for when they reached New Mexico territory. "We should aim for a smaller town," Rebecca suggested on their third night out. "Somewhere growing but not too established, a place where newcomers are normal, not noteworthy." "What about Willits?" Jackson proposed. "Wait, no, that's in California. I'm thinking of Las Cruces up in New Mexico territory. It's on the Rio Grande, good farming country, and it's growing because of the railroad. Folks coming and going all the time." "Las Cruces," Rebecca said thoughtfully. "That could work. What would we do there? We'd need some kind of income." "I can work cattle or horses, do ranch work." "You could maybe start small, selling your herbs and baskets, see if there's call for other work." "I could teach," Rebecca said quietly. "Not formally, not in a school, but private tutoring maybe, children of ranchers who can't make it to town for regular schooling." Jackson smiled. "There you go. That's thinking about living, not just surviving." As the days passed, Jackson noticed Rebecca beginning to relax. She smiled more often, laughed at his stories. She started initiating conversations instead of just responding to his questions. The fear was still there. He could see it in the way she'd tense up whenever they spotted other travelers in the distance, but it was becoming less consuming. They'd been traveling for just over a week when they had their first real test. They'd stopped in a tiny settlement called Cedar Springs to buy supplies, posing as husband and wife for the first time to the general store owner, a weathered man named Horace, who seemed more interested in making a sale than asking questions. Everything went smoothly until they were leaving. A man on horseback rode into town, wearing a marshal's badge and leading a pack horse. He wasn't looking for them specifically, was clearly just passing through, but Rebecca went pale at the sight of the badge. "Easy," Jackson murmured, placing a hand on the small of her back in what he hoped looked like a casual husbandly gesture. "We're just folks buying supplies. Nothing suspicious about that." The marshal tipped his hat as he rode past. "Afternoon, folks." "Afternoon, Marshal," Jackson replied easily, while Rebecca managed a tight smile and a nod. They mounted Daisy and rode out of town at a normal pace, though Jackson could feel Rebecca trembling against his back. Only when they were well out of sight of Cedar Springs did she let out a shaky breath. "I thought he was going to recognize me," she whispered. "He didn't even look twice at you," Jackson pointed out gently. "Rebecca, you've got to trust that you're not as recognizable as you think. You've been living rough for 2 years. You don't look anything like the society wife you were in Tucson. Marcus could have spread wanted posters, could have put a price on my head. For what crime? Running away from your husband isn't illegal, even if it's frowned upon. And if he tried to claim you were involved in your sister's death, why would you run? No, if he's looking for you, he's doing it quietly, through private channels. A territorial marshal passing through Cedar Springs wouldn't know anything about it." Rebecca wanted to believe him, Jackson could tell, but fear had been her companion for so long that it was hard to let go. That night, she had nightmares, waking with a stifled gasp that brought Jackson instantly alert. He found her sitting by the dying fire, hugging her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Want to talk about it?" he asked softly, settling down near her but not too close. "It's always the same dream," Rebecca said, her voice rough with tears. "I'm back in that house in Tucson. Ruth is there, alive, and I'm trying to warn her, trying to get her to leave before Marcus comes home. But she won't listen. She just keeps setting the table for dinner like everything's normal. And then I hear his footsteps on the porch, and I know what's coming, but I can't move, can't speak. I just have to watch it happen again." "That's a hard burden to carry," Jackson said. "I should have saved her. If I'd known, if I'd seen the signs, I could have sent her away before she visited. I could have done something." "Rebecca, you didn't pull that trigger. Marcus did. The blame is his, not yours." "I know that in my head," Rebecca said, tapping her temple, "but my heart doesn't believe it." Jackson wished he had words of wisdom, something that would ease her pain. But he'd carried his own guilt for years, guilt over surviving when his parents hadn't, guilt over not being there when they needed him. He knew that some wounds never fully healed, you just learn to live with the scars. "Come here," he said gently, opening his arms. Rebecca hesitated, and Jackson thought she might refuse. They'd been careful about physical contact, maintaining the boundaries she'd set. But grief and fear had stripped away her defenses, and she moved into his embrace, letting him hold her while she cried. Jackson just held her, one hand stroking her back in what he hoped was a comforting gesture, murmuring soft reassurances. When her tears finally subsided, Rebecca pulled back, wiping her eyes. "I'm sorry. I know we agreed about boundaries. You needed comfort, that's different." "Don't apologize for being human, Rebecca." She gave him a watery smile. "You're a good man, Jackson Ford." "Fuller," he corrected automatically, then paused. "Or I guess it is Ford now, isn't it?" "I suppose it is. For both of us." They reached Las Cruces 3 weeks after leaving the cave. The town was everything Jackson had promised, bustling with activity from the nearby railroad and the farms along the Rio Grande. Adobe buildings lined dusty streets and people of all descriptions mixed together. Anglo settlers, Mexican families who'd been there for generations, traders, ranchers, railroad workers, and drifters. They found a boarding house run by a Mexican widow named Senora Martinez, who asked no questions when Jackson requested 2 rooms. "For now," Jackson explained, playing the role they'd created. "My wife is particular about her privacy, and I'm a restless sleeper. Once we get our own place, it'll be different." Senora Martinez smiled knowingly. "Many young couples need time to adjust. The rooms are $3 a week each, meals included." It was more than Jackson had hoped to spend, but the boarding house was clean and respectable, and he could see Rebecca relax when she saw the tidy room with its real bed and clean linens. They'd been sleeping rough for weeks, and the promise of a comfortable bed and regular meals was clearly appealing. Jackson found work quickly at her ranch outside town, owned by a man named Donald Fletcher, who needed hands for the fall roundup. The pay was decent, and Fletcher didn't ask too many questions about Jackson's past, just seemed satisfied that he knew his way around cattle and horses. Rebecca was more cautious about establishing herself. She spent the first week just observing the town, learning its rhythms and patterns. She bought fabric and sewed herself new dresses, practical but pretty, transforming gradually from the wild woman of the cave to someone who could blend into town life. She let her hair grow, styled it the way other women wore theirs, and slowly began to look less hunted and more settled. It was Jackson who suggested she approach the local priest about tutoring. "Father Gonzalez knows everyone," he explained. "If anyone knows which families might need a tutor, it's him." Rebecca was nervous but determined. She put on her best dress and walked to the small Catholic church on the edge of town. Father Gonzalez was a kind man in his 60s who'd served the community for decades. He listened to Rebecca's carefully rehearsed story about being a newlywed looking to use her education to help the community, and his eyes twinkled with what might have been understanding that there was more to the story, but he didn't pry. "There are several families who might benefit from your services," he said in accented English. "The Harrington family has 3 children who are too young for the long ride to the school in town, and the Mendozas have a daughter who is very bright but struggles with English. Perhaps you could help both families." Within a month, Rebecca had 4 regular students and a growing reputation as an excellent teacher. The income wasn't substantial, but combined with Jackson's wages, they were managing well. They fell into a comfortable routine, eating breakfast together at the boarding house before Jackson rode out to the Fletcher ranch and Rebecca walked to her students' homes. Evenings were spent together, sharing the day's events, planning for the future. "We should start looking for a house," Jackson suggested one evening as they sat on the boarding house porch, watching the sunset paint the Oregon mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Something small, just a couple of rooms, but our own place." Rebecca looked surprised. "Can we afford that?" "Been saving. And I talked to Fletcher about maybe buying some land from him, a small parcel near the river. There's a house on it, needs work but it's sound. He'd sell it cheap if I agreed to work for him another year." "A year is a long time," Rebecca said carefully. "Are you sure you want to stay here that long?" Jackson turned to look at her, really look at her. Over the past 2 months, he'd watched her transform from a frightened woman hiding in a cave to someone beginning to hope again. Her smiles came easier now, and the shadows in her eyes were slowly fading. She laughed at his jokes, debated politics with passion, and had started talking about the future with something that sounded like excitement instead of fear. And somewhere along the way, without quite meaning to, Jackson had fallen in love with her. He hadn't planned it, hadn't wanted it even. They were supposed to be partners, helping each other out, nothing more. But love didn't ask permission. It just settled into his heart like it had always belonged there, and now he couldn't imagine a future that didn't include Rebecca. "I'm sure," he said quietly, "unless you're not, unless you want to move on." Rebecca met his eyes, and Jackson saw something there that made his breath catch. "No," she said softly. "I don't want to move on. I like it here. I like the work, the people. I like having a place that feels like it could be home." "With me?" Jackson asked, needing to hear it. "With you," Rebecca confirmed, and her hand found his on the porch railing, her fingers intertwining with his. It was the first time she'd reached for him first, the first time she'd initiated any kind of physical contact. Jackson squeezed her hand gently, his heart hammering in his chest. "Rebecca, I know we started this as an arrangement, 2 people helping each other out. But somewhere along the way it became more for me. You became more." Rebecca's eyes widened, and Jackson could see fear warring with something else, something that looked like hope. "Jackson, I don't know if I can be what you need. What Marcus did, what I saw, it broke something in me. I don't know if I can trust like that again, love like that again." "I'm not Marcus," Jackson said firmly, "and I'm not asking you to be anything you're not ready to be. I'm just telling you how I feel. You can do whatever you want with that information. If you want to keep things as they are, partners and nothing more, I can accept that. Your friendship means more to me than anything else." "But you want more," Rebecca said, not a question but a statement. "I do," Jackson admitted, "but only if you do too, only if and when you're ready." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, and Jackson forced himself to wait, to give her the time and space to process. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I might want more too. But I'm scared, Jackson. I'm scared of trusting wrong again, of being hurt again." "Love is always a risk," Jackson said. "I can't promise I'll never hurt you or disappoint you. I'm just a man, Rebecca, and men make mistakes. But I can promise I'll never raise my hand to you. I'll never try to control you or diminish you. I'll respect you as an equal always." "That's all I ever wanted," Rebecca said, tears sliding down her cheeks. "That's all Ruth wanted too, just to be treated like a person, not a possession." Jackson reached up and gently wiped away her tears with his thumb. "Then that's what you'll have. I swear it." Rebecca leaned into his touch, and Jackson felt something fundamental shift between them. This wasn't just partnership anymore, wasn't just convenience or mutual benefit. This was the beginning of something real, something that could last if they were brave enough to try. That night, for the first time since they'd met, Rebecca kissed him. It was tentative and careful, and Jackson let her control everything, let her set the pace. When she pulled back, she was smiling, really smiling, the kind of smile that transformed her entire face. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," she admitted, blushing. "Yeah?" Jackson asked, grinning. "Yeah, but I was afraid." "And now I'm still afraid," Rebecca said honestly. "But I'm more afraid of missing out on something good because I let fear control me." They bought the house from Fletcher a month later. It was small, just 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, but it sat on 5 acres of good land near the Rio Grande. The roof leaked in 2 places. The windows needed replacing, and the floor was uneven. But Jackson and Rebecca threw themselves into fixing it up with the enthusiasm of people building something together. Rebecca painted the walls a warm cream color while Jackson repaired the roof. They replaced the windows with glass that Rebecca haggled for in town, and Jackson built a proper kitchen, complete with a real stove that Rebecca eyed with undisguised delight. "I haven't cooked on a real stove in over 2 years," she said, running her hands over the smooth iron surface. "I'd forgotten what it was like." "Well, now you can cook all you want," Jackson said, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. They were more comfortable with affection now, though Rebecca still had moments where she'd tense up if startled. Jackson had learned to move slowly to announce his presence, to always give her space to retreat if she needed it. "I'm not sure I remember how," Rebecca teased, leaning back against his chest. "Guess we'll have to learn together." They moved into the house in early December of 1883, 6 months after Jackson had found Rebecca in that cave. Senora Martinez had cried when they left the boarding house, pressing a basket of food into Rebecca's hands and making them promise to visit often. Their first night in the house was cold, winter settling over the Rio Grande Valley with unusual force. They'd built a fire in the fireplace Jackson had repaired, and after a dinner of stew and fresh bread, they sat together on the floor, backs against the sofa they'd bought secondhand in town. "This feels surreal," Rebecca said quietly. 6 months ago, I was living in a cave, certain I'd spend the rest of my life alone, and now I'm here in a real home with someone who cares about me. More than cares, Jackson corrected gently. I love you, Rebecca, have for a while now. Rebecca turned to face him, her eyes bright with emotion. I love you too. I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to say those words again, but I do. I love you, Jackson. They kissed then, deeper and more passionate than before, and when Jackson pulled back to ask if she was sure if she was ready, Rebecca nodded. I'm sure. I want this. I want you. Their wedding night came 3 months later in March of 1884. They decided to make it official, to actually get married rather than just pretending. Father Gonzalez performed the ceremony in the small church, with Senora Martinez and Donald Fletcher as witnesses. Rebecca wore a simple white dress she'd sewn herself, and Jackson wore his best suit, bought new for the occasion. When Father Gonzalez pronounced them husband and wife, when Jackson kissed his bride in front of God and witnesses, it felt like a new beginning for both of them. They were no longer running from the past, but building toward the future. The wedding celebration was small but joyful. The Harringtons and Mendozas came, along with several other families from town who'd grown fond of the young couple. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, and for the first time in years, Rebecca looked genuinely happy, her face flushed with joy and wine, her eyes bright with hope. That night in their little house by the river, Jackson and Rebecca consummated their marriage with tenderness and care. Jackson was patient, attentive to Rebecca's needs, always checking to make sure she was comfortable, that she wanted to continue. And Rebecca, though nervous at first, gradually relaxed into his embrace, trusting him with her body as she'd already trusted him with her heart. Afterward, lying tangled together in their bed, Rebecca traced patterns on Jackson's chest with her fingertips. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what? For being patient with me, for giving me time to heal, for showing me that love doesn't have to hurt." Jackson pressed a kiss to her forehead. "You never have to thank me for that. Loving you is the easiest thing I've ever done." Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Jackson continued working for Fletcher, gradually buying more land and starting to build up his own small herd of cattle. Rebecca's tutoring business grew, and she started teaching Sunday school at the church, something that brought her great satisfaction. They talked often about starting a family, but Rebecca was hesitant. "What if Marcus finds me?" she'd say. "What if I'm pregnant and he shows up? I couldn't bear to have a child taken from me." "He's not going to find you," Jackson would reassure her. "It's been 3 years since you left Tucson. If he was going to find you, he would have by now, and even if he did, he'd have to go through me first." But Rebecca's fear was deeply rooted, and Jackson didn't push. He figured she'd be ready when she was ready, and until then, he was content with their life as it was. The decision was taken out of their hands in the summer of 1885. Rebecca had been feeling poorly for a few weeks, tired and queasy, before she finally realized what it meant. She told Jackson over dinner one evening, her face a mixture of joy and terror. "I'm pregnant," she said simply. Jackson nearly dropped his fork. "You're sure?" "I'm sure. 3 months along, I think." Jackson came around the table and pulled her into his arms, his heart soaring even as he felt her trembling. "This is wonderful news, Rebecca. We're going to have a baby." "I'm scared," Rebecca admitted, clinging to him. "I know. But we'll face it together, whatever comes. You're not alone anymore, remember?" "I remember," Rebecca said, and slowly, the fear in her eyes was replaced by something else. Excitement. Hope. The beginning of joy. The pregnancy was difficult. Rebecca was sick often, and as her belly grew, so did her anxiety. She became jumpy again, the way she'd been when Jackson first found her. She'd check the windows obsessively, making sure the curtains were drawn. She'd tense up whenever they had visitors, even friends they'd known for months. Jackson did his best to reassure her, but he understood that her fear wasn't entirely irrational. The threat of Marcus was real, even if distant, so he took precautions. He bought another gun and taught Rebecca how to shoot it properly. He made sure the house was secure, installed better locks on the doors. He let it be known around town that anyone asking questions about his wife should be reported to him immediately. Father Gonzalez noticed Rebecca's increasing anxiety and gently suggested she might benefit from talking about her fears. "The burden you carry is heavy," he said kindly. "Perhaps sharing it more fully might lighten the load." So Rebecca told him the full story. Not the fiction they'd been living, but the truth about Marcus, about Ruth, about the 2 years in the cave. Father Gonzalez listened without judgment, and when she finished, he simply said, "You are not the same woman who ran away 3 years ago. You are stronger now, and you are not alone. God has brought you to this place, to these people, to this man. Trust in that." Rebecca cried then, and afterward she seemed lighter somehow. The anxiety didn't disappear entirely, but it became more manageable. She started to let herself enjoy the pregnancy, planning for the baby, sewing tiny clothes, and setting up a cradle that Jackson had carved from cottonwood. In February of 1886, on a cold, clear night, Rebecca went into labor. Jackson rode hard to fetch the midwife, a practical German woman named Frau Schmidt, who delivered half the babies in Las Cruces. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Jackson stayed by Rebecca's side the whole time, holding her hand, wiping her face with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement. When the baby finally arrived, red-faced and squalling, Frau Schmidt announced, "You have a son." Jackson looked down at the tiny, perfect creature in the midwife's arms and felt his heart expand in a way he hadn't known was possible. A son. He had a son. "Let me see him," Rebecca said weakly, and Frau Schmidt placed the baby in her arms. Rebecca gazed down at the infant, tears streaming down her face. "He's beautiful," she whispered. "He's perfect." "What should we name him?" Jackson asked, stroking the baby's soft head. Rebecca looked up at Jackson, her eyes full of love. "James, after your father." "James Ruth, for both our fathers and for my sister." "James Ruth Fuller," Jackson said, trying it out. "That's a strong name." "Ford," Rebecca corrected gently. "We're Fords, remember? Right. James Ruth Ford, I keep forgetting." "I don't," Rebecca said. "The Fords are who we are now. Who will always be." Baby James was a good child, healthy and strong. He had Rebecca's blue eyes and Jackson's dark hair, and from the beginning he seemed to know he was loved. Rebecca proved to be a devoted mother, though Jackson could see her struggling sometimes with the fear that something would take her son from her the way Ruth had been taken. "He's safe," Jackson would remind her when he found her standing over the cradle at night, just watching James breathe. "We're all safe here." And for 3 years that was true. They built a good life in Las Cruces. Jackson's herd grew, and he bought more land from Fletcher. Rebecca continued teaching, bringing James with her to lessons, much to the delight of her students who loved having a baby to dote on. They made friends, became part of the community, put down roots deeper than either of them had ever had before. James was 3 years old when the past came calling. It was a hot day in August of 1889, and Jackson was in town buying supplies while Rebecca taught at the Harrington place. He was loading sacks of flour into the wagon when he noticed a stranger watching him from across the street. The man was well dressed in a suit too fine for the dusty streets of Las Cruces, with cold eyes and the look of someone who'd found what he was searching for. Jackson's blood ran cold. He didn't know who this man was, but instinct told him it was connected to Rebecca, to Marcus, to the life she'd run from, the stranger approached, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Excuse me, friend. I'm looking for someone. A woman named Rebecca Sawyer. I was told you might know where I could find her." "Never heard of her," Jackson said, keeping his voice casual while his mind raced. "You might want to check at the church. Father Gonzalez knows just about everyone in these parts." "Funny thing," the stranger said, his smile turning sharp. "I already checked with the good father, and he sent me to you. Said you're married to a woman named Rebecca. Now, I'm not saying your Rebecca is the Rebecca I'm looking for, but I'd sure like to ask her some questions." "My wife doesn't appreciate strangers asking questions," Jackson said, his tone hardening. "Maybe you should state your business clear and explain why you're looking for this other Rebecca." "Her husband hired me to find her. He's quite concerned about her welfare. She disappeared several years ago, and he's been searching ever since." "If she disappeared, maybe she had good reason," Jackson pointed out. "Maybe. Or maybe she's confused, unstable. Either way, her husband has a legal right to know where she is." "Now, are you going to introduce me to your wife, or do I need to find her myself?" Jackson's hand moved to rest on the gun at his hip, a casual gesture that nonetheless carried clear meaning. "You'll stay away from my wife. Whatever business you think you have, you're wrong. The woman you're looking for doesn't exist anymore." "Is that a threat?" "That's a promise. You go back to whoever hired you and tell them Rebecca Sawyer is dead. Died years ago. There's nothing here for him." The stranger studied Jackson for a long moment, then shrugged. "I'll pass along your message. But I should warn you, Mr. Fuller, that interfering with a man's right to his wife is a serious matter. The law tends to side with the husband in these situations." "Then it's a good thing there's no husband involved here," Jackson said. "Just a stranger making accusations with no proof." After the man left, Jackson abandoned his supplies and rode hard to the Harrington place. He found Rebecca in the yard, playing with James and the Harrington children. She took one look at his face and knew something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked, fear creeping into her voice. Jackson waited until they were alone, the children occupied with a game, before telling her about the stranger. Rebecca went pale, her hands shaking as she clutched James to her chest. "He found me," she whispered. "After all this time, Marcus found me." "We don't know that for sure," Jackson said, though he knew it was true. "Maybe the man was bluffing, fishing for information." "We have to leave," Rebecca said, panic rising in her voice. "We have to pack up and go tonight, right now." "Rebecca, calm down," Jackson said gently, taking her shoulders. "We're not running, not this time. But Marcus will come. That man will tell him where I am, and he'll come for me." "Let him come," Jackson said firmly. "This is our home, our life. We're not giving it up without a fight." "You don't understand what he's like," Rebecca said, tears streaming down her face. "He's powerful, connected. He'll find a way to take everything from me to take James." "No, he won't. Because we're going to do this right, legal. We're going to see a lawyer and make sure everything is documented. Our marriage, James's birth, our property. We'll build a legal wall so thick Marcus won't be able to touch us." Rebecca wanted to believe him. Jackson could see that, but fear had her in its grip. That night she barely slept, jumping at every sound. James sensed his mother's distress and was fussy, refusing to settle. Jackson stayed up with them both, his rifle across his lap, watching the windows for any sign of trouble. The next morning, Jackson rode into town and found the best lawyer in Las Cruces, a sharp woman named Patricia Hensley who'd come west from Boston after her husband died. She listened to Jackson's carefully edited version of the story, Rebecca's fear that her abusive first husband might try to claim her, and nodded briskly. "First things first, we need to verify your marriage. You said Father Gonzalez performed the ceremony." "Yes, madam," March of 1884. Good. Church records are admissible in court, and your son was born in February of 1886, correct? After your marriage? Yes, madam. Then legally, James is your son. Even if her first marriage was still valid when you married her, which I doubt since you said he was violent and she fled for her safety, any court would recognize your marriage and your paternity rights. But to be absolutely certain, we should file for a divorce decree on her behalf from the first marriage, citing abandonment and abuse. Can we do that? Jackson asked, hope rising. Even though she's here and he's in Arizona, we can certainly try. And even if we can't get a formal divorce, we can establish that she's been living as your wife for 5 years, that you have a child together, that she's a respected member of this community. That carries weight, Mr. Ford. Over the next few weeks, Patricia Hensley built what she called their legal fortress. She gathered testimony from Father Gonzalez, Senora Martinez, the Harringtons, the Mendozas, and dozens of other families who knew and respected the Fords. She documented Rebecca's teaching work, their property ownership, their standing in the community. She filed paperwork for a divorce between Rebecca and Marcus Sawyer, citing abuse, violent behavior, and a pattern of threatening conduct. And then they waited. Marcus arrived in Las Cruces in October, just as the weather was turning cool. He came with lawyers and a marshal's writ, claiming that Rebecca was his legal wife and demanding she return to Arizona with him. He was everything Rebecca had described, handsome and charming on the surface, with cold eyes that promised violence beneath the polish. Patricia Hensley met him at the courthouse steps and handed him a stack of legal documents. "Your wife filed for divorce 3 months ago," she said crisply. "The petition has been approved by the territorial court. Rebecca Sawyer no longer exists. There is only Rebecca Ford, wife of Jackson Ford, mother of James Ford, and a legal resident of New Mexico Territory. You have no claim here." Marcus's face darkened with rage. "That's impossible. She can't divorce me without my consent. She can when there's documented evidence of abuse and violence. The court found in her favor. If you'd like to appeal, you're welcome to try, but I should warn you that the evidence against you is substantial, including testimony from witnesses to your violent behavior in Tucson." "What witnesses?" Marcus demanded. "Everyone in Tucson knows I'm a respected businessman." "Servants talk, Mr. Sawyer, especially when they're no longer in your employ." We tracked down 3 former household staff who were willing to testify about the bruises they saw on Mrs. Sawyer, the screaming they heard, and the threats you made. One of them even testified about the night Ruth Sawyer died, how you came home drunk and shot her in what you later claimed was a case of mistaken identity. Marcus's lawyer, a nervous man who clearly hadn't expected this level of preparation, leaned in to whisper urgently to his client. Marcus shook him off. "I want to see her," he demanded. "I have a right to see my wife." "You have no wife," Patricia said firmly. "Not here. If you attempt to approach Rebecca Ford, if you threaten her or her family in any way, I will have you arrested for harassment and trespassing. This is your only warning." Jackson watched this exchange from the courthouse window, his hand tight on the windowsill. He wanted to be down there, wanted to face Marcus himself, but Patricia had insisted he stay out of sight. "Let the law handle this," she'd said. "Don't give him any ammunition to claim you're the aggressor." Marcus left town that evening, his lawyers in tow, but not before making it clear this wasn't over. "She's still my wife in the eyes of God," he shouted loud enough for half the town to hear. "This isn't finished." Rebecca was terrified that he'd come back, that he'd find a way to hurt them. For weeks, she barely left the house, keeping James close, jumping at shadows. Jackson hired 2 ranch hands not just to help with the cattle, but to keep watch, to make sure no one approached the property who shouldn't be there. Slowly, as the weeks turned into months with no sign of Marcus, Rebecca began to relax. Patricia Hensley assured them that the divorce was legal and binding, that Marcus had no recourse under territorial law. "He might not like it," she said, "but that doesn't change the facts. You're free, Rebecca, truly free." It took time for Rebecca to believe it, but gradually she began to embrace her freedom. She started teaching again, venturing into town, laughing with friends. The shadows lifted from her eyes, and the woman Jackson had fallen in love with emerged fully, no longer hiding, no longer running. They had 2 more children over the next few years, a daughter they named Ruth in 1891, and another son they named Thomas in 1893. The ranch prospered, growing from a small operation to a substantial spread. Rebecca's teaching evolved into running a proper small school on their property, educating children from surrounding ranches who couldn't make it to town every day. James grew into a bright, curious boy who loved the ranch and the animals. Ruth was quiet and thoughtful, with a gift for music that delighted Rebecca. Thomas was still a baby, but already showing signs of his father's stubbornness and his mother's quick mind. In the summer of 1895, 12 years after Jackson had found Rebecca in that cave, they sat together on the porch of their house, watching the sun set over the Organ Mountains. The children were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the warm evening air. "You ever think about that cave?" Jackson asked, his arm around Rebecca's shoulders. "Sometimes," Rebecca admitted. "It feels like a different life, a different person, like it happened to someone else. In a way it did. You're not the same woman who was hiding there." "No, I'm not. That woman was broken, afraid, just surviving. This woman is whole, loved, living." She turned to look at Jackson, her eyes full of love and gratitude. "You gave me that. You gave me my life back." "We gave each other that," Jackson corrected. "I was drifting before I met you, no purpose, no direction. You gave me a reason to stay in one place, to build something that would last." "We built it together," Rebecca said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "A home, a family, a life worth living." As the sun sank lower, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Jackson thought about the long, winding path that had brought them here. The loss and pain they'd both endured, the fear they'd faced together, the love they'd built from the ruins of their separate pasts. It hadn't been easy, and there had been times when the outcome was far from certain. But they'd persevered, held onto each other, and created something beautiful. "I love you, Rebecca Ford," Jackson said, kissing the top of her head. "I love you too, Jackson Ford," Rebecca replied, contentment evident in her voice. The years continued to pass with the gentle rhythm of a life well lived. James, at 16, was already taller than his father and showed a natural talent for working with horses. He'd started training and selling them, turning a nice profit that he saved carefully, talking about someday expanding the ranch operations. Ruth, at 14, had become a gifted pianist, practicing for hours on the upright piano Jackson had surprised Rebecca with on their 10th anniversary. The music that floated from their house became a familiar, beloved sound to neighbors and visitors alike. Thomas, now 12, was the adventurous one, always exploring the property, bringing home interesting rocks and asking endless questions about how things worked. He reminded Rebecca of Ruth, her sister, with his insatiable curiosity and bright spirit. Sometimes it hurt to see the resemblance, but mostly it brought her comfort, as if a piece of her sister lived on in this joyful, inquisitive boy. In 1899, Jackson and Rebecca celebrated their 15th wedding anniversary with a party that brought together friends from all over the territory. The ranch had grown into one of the most successful in the area, and the school Rebecca ran was now attended by over 20 children, with 2 assistant teachers helping her manage the load. Father Gonzalez, now in his 70s and moving slowly, blessed their continued union with tears in his eyes. "I remember when you first came to me," he said to Rebecca. "So afraid, so broken. And look at you now. You are a testament to God's grace and the power of love to heal." Senora Martinez, still spry despite her years, hugged them both fiercely. "I knew you were special from the beginning," she declared. "I could see the love growing even when you thought you were hiding it." As the party wound down and guests began to leave, Jackson and Rebecca found themselves alone on the porch once more, their favorite spot for reflection and conversation. The children were inside, James and Ruth ensuring Thomas got to bed despite his protests that he wasn't tired. 15 years, Rebecca mused. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, and sometimes it feels like yesterday that you walked into that cave. "Best decision I ever made seeking shelter from that storm," Jackson said. "It was fate," Rebecca said softly. "It had to be." "What are the odds that you'd find that specific cave, that specific day, at that specific time?" "Whatever the odds, I'm grateful for them," Jackson replied. "Though I have to admit, I had no idea what I was getting into when I offered to help you start over." Rebecca laughed. "Neither did I. I thought you'd get me to a town, help me get settled, and then drift on like you said you would. I never imagined you'd stay, never imagined this." She gestured at the house, the land, the life they'd built. "I never imagined I'd want to stay," Jackson admitted, "but you changed everything for me. You gave me a reason to stop running from my own ghosts." They fell into comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the night. Crickets chirped in the grass, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. These were the sounds of home, familiar and comforting. "I got a letter last week," Rebecca said suddenly. "I didn't mention it because I wasn't sure how I felt about it, but I think I need to tell you." Jackson tensed slightly. "What kind of letter?" "From an attorney in Tucson. Marcus died. Apparently, he was thrown from a horse 3 months ago, hit his head, and never woke up." Jackson processed this information, trying to gauge how Rebecca felt about it. "How do you feel about that?" "Relief, mostly," Rebecca said honestly. "I know I shouldn't speak ill of the dead, but I can't mourn him. He took too much from me, hurt me too deeply. But there's also this sense of finality, like the last chain connecting me to that old life has been broken." "You were already free of him," Jackson pointed out. "Legally, yes. But there was always this fear in the back of my mind that he'd find a way to hurt us, to take the children, to destroy what we'd built. Now that fear is gone. He can't hurt anyone ever again. The children never have to know about him," Jackson said. "As far as they're concerned, you and I have always been together." "They'll need to know someday," Rebecca said. "When they're older, when they can understand. I don't want there to be secrets between us. But for now, yes, let them have their innocence." The letter from the Tucson attorney had contained more than just news of Marcus's death. It informed Rebecca that she was entitled to half of his estate, a considerable sum. Rebecca's first instinct had been to refuse it, wanting nothing from the man who'd caused her so much pain. But Jackson had convinced her to think practically. That money could pay for the children's education, he'd pointed out. Could help expand the school, help more children learn. You could turn something terrible into something good. So Rebecca had accepted the inheritance, though she donated a significant portion to the church and to various charities supporting women in difficult situations. The rest she put into a trust for the children's education and into expanding the school. Within a year, They'd built a proper schoolhouse on their property with 4 rooms, a library, and housing for teachers. Rebecca hired 3 more teachers, and the Ford School, as it came to be known, became one of the best educational institutions in the territory. By 1902, James was engaged to a sweet girl named Martha from a neighboring ranch. They planned to marry in the spring, and James wanted to build a house on the property, to continue working the ranch with his father. Jackson was thrilled, both to have his son staying close and to see him so happy with a good woman who clearly adored him. Ruth was attending a music conservatory in Denver, her talent having outgrown what local teachers could offer. She wrote home frequently, her letters full of excitement about her studies and the performances she attended. Rebecca missed her terribly, but was proud that her daughter was following her passion. Thomas, at 16, was apprenticing with a veterinarian in Las Cruces, showing the same curiosity about animals that he'd shown about everything else as a child. He came home on weekends, full of stories about the animals he'd helped treat and the things he was learning. Jackson, now in his mid-40s, had settled comfortably into the role of prosperous rancher and proud father. His dark hair was streaked with gray, and lines crinkled around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. But Rebecca thought he'd never looked more handsome. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who knew his worth and his place in the world. Rebecca had turned 42 that year, and though her hair was still mostly blonde with just a few strands of silver, she felt the years in her joints on cold mornings. But they were good years, earned years, and she wore them with pride. She was no longer the frightened woman hiding in a cave or even the nervous young wife learning to trust again. She was Rebecca Ford, teacher, mother, wife, and pillar of her community. In the spring of 1903, James and Martha were married in a beautiful ceremony at the church. Father Gonzalez had passed away the previous winter, and a young priest named Father Miguel had taken his place, but the old priest spirit seemed to hover over the ceremony, blessing this next generation. Rebecca cried through the entire wedding, not from sadness but from overwhelming joy and gratitude. She thought of Ruth, her sister, who should have been there to see this. She thought of her younger self, broken and hiding, who never could have imagined this day. And she thought of Jackson, who'd given her the chance to heal and the space to become herself again. As if sensing her thoughts, Jackson reached over and took her hand, squeezing gently. 20 years, she thought. 20 years since he'd found her in that cave. 20 years of love, growth, and building a life together. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up under the cottonwood trees and music provided by a band from town. Ruth had come home for the wedding and played several pieces on the piano that had been moved outside for the occasion. Her playing was stunning, and Rebecca watched with pride as her daughter's fingers flew over the keys. Thomas gave a toast that was both funny and heartfelt, welcoming Martha to the family and teasing his brother about finally settling down. Martha's family, good people who'd ranched in the area for decades, mingled easily with the Fords' friends and neighbors. As the sun set and lanterns were lit, Jackson and Rebecca danced to a slow waltz, moving easily together with the familiarity of long practice. They danced at their own wedding, 19 years ago, and at countless celebrations since. But this felt special somehow, watching their eldest child begin his own journey into marriage and family. "We did all right, didn't we?" Jackson murmured in Rebecca's ear as they swayed to the music. "We did better than all right," Rebecca replied. "We built something beautiful." "Couldn't have done it without you. Or without you," Rebecca said, pulling back to look into his eyes. "We were always stronger together." Life continued to unfold with its mixture of joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge. Martha gave birth to Jackson and Rebecca's first grandchild in 1904, a boy they named Jackson after his grandfather. Rebecca held her grandson and felt the circle of life closing in the most beautiful way. This child would never know fear the way she had, would never have to hide or run. He would grow up surrounded by love and security, the benefits of the life she and Jackson had fought so hard to build. Ruth married in 1906, choosing a fellow musician she'd met at the conservatory. They settled in Denver, where they both taught and performed, but visited regularly, filling the house with music and laughter. Thomas finished his veterinary training and opened a practice in Las Cruces, though he still lived at home, claiming the commute wasn't that far and he wasn't ready to give up his mother's cooking. The ranch continued to prosper under Jackson and James's joint management. They'd expanded into breeding horses as well as cattle, and their stock was known throughout the territory for quality and temperament. The school continued to grow, with Rebecca now overseeing 5 teachers and over 40 students. In 1912, New Mexico achieved statehood, a momentous occasion that Jackson and Rebecca celebrated with their community. They'd been part of building this place, part of transforming a rough territory into a proper state. It felt like validation of all their hard work and dedication. That same year, Rebecca's health began to fail. It started small, tiredness that rest didn't cure, pains in her joints that grew worse instead of better. The doctors in Las Cruces were stumped, suggesting everything from rheumatism to simple old age. But Rebecca knew it was something more serious, could feel her body slowly betraying her. She didn't tell Jackson at first, didn't want to worry him. But he noticed anyway, saw the way she moved more carefully, the way she sometimes had to stop and catch her breath after simple tasks. When he confronted her, she broke down and told him everything. "I'm scared," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I fought so hard to live, to build this life, and now my body is failing me." Jackson held her close, his own eyes wet with tears. "We'll fight this too, together. We'll find the best doctors, try every treatment. I'm not ready to lose you, Rebecca." They went to specialists in Albuquerque, even traveled to Denver to see doctors Ruth had recommended. But the diagnosis was always the same, some form of internal illness that the medical science of the day couldn't cure, only manage. They gave her medicines for the pain, told her to rest, suggested she might have a few good years left if she took care of herself. Rebecca returned home determined to make the most of whatever time she had. She continued teaching, though she reduced her hours. She spent time with her grandchildren, now numbering 4, telling them stories and passing on family history. She and Jackson took walks every evening, moving slowly but savoring each moment together. "You have any regrets?" Jackson asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching yet another sunset paint the mountains in brilliant colors. "Only one," Rebecca said softly. "I wish I'd had more time. But I can't regret anything that brought me here to you, to this life. Even the pain, even the fear, it was all part of the path. I'm grateful for every day I've had with you," Jackson said, his voice rough with emotion. "And I'm grateful you found me in that cave," Rebecca replied. "Grateful you saw past the fear and anger to the person underneath. Grateful you gave me the chance to heal and the space to love again." They sat in silence, hands linked, as the sun sank below the horizon. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight they had each other, and that had always been enough. Rebecca lived for another 3 years, defying the doctor's predictions. She was there to see Thomas marry in 1913, there to meet 2 more grandchildren, there to celebrate Jackson's 56th birthday in 1914. The pain grew worse toward the end, but she bore it with grace and determination, never complaining, always finding something to be grateful for. She passed away peacefully in her sleep on a warm June night in 1915, 32 years after Jackson had found her in that cave. Jackson woke to find her gone, her hand still in his, a slight smile on her face as if she died dreaming of something beautiful. The funeral was huge, with people coming from all over the state to pay their respects. Rebecca had touched so many lives through her teaching, her kindness, her quiet strength. The church overflowed with mourners, and the line of people waiting to offer condolences to the family stretched out the door. Jackson stood through it all, shaking hands, accepting sympathy, holding himself together through sheer force of will. But that night, alone in the house they'd shared for over 30 years, he finally let himself fall apart. He cried for the woman he'd loved, for the years they'd had and the years they'd been robbed of, for the hole her absence left in his heart. James found him the next morning, still sitting in the chair by the empty bed, eyes red but dry. "Pa," he said gently, "you need to eat something, need to rest." "I don't know how to do this without her," Jackson admitted. "Everything I built, everything I am, it was all with her, for her." "She'd want you to keep going," James said. "You know she would." And Jackson did know. Rebecca had been a fighter, a survivor, someone who chose life even when it would have been easier to give up. She'd want him to honor that, to keep living fully even in the face of loss, so Jackson did. He threw himself into the ranch, into his grandchildren, into the community Rebecca had cared about so deeply. He kept the school running, hiring new teachers to replace Rebecca and ensuring her vision continued. He attended church every Sunday, sitting in the pew they'd shared for decades. But he was lonely. The house felt too big, too empty without Rebecca's laughter and conversation. He'd wake in the night sometimes, reaching for her before remembering she was gone. The grief was a constant companion, sometimes sharp and overwhelming, sometimes a dull ache he carried everywhere. The years passed. Jackson grew old, his hair going completely white, his movements slowing. But his mind stayed sharp, and his love for Rebecca never dimmed. He'd talk about her constantly, telling his grandchildren stories about their grandmother, keeping her memory alive. In 1921, Jackson suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed. James and Martha moved him into their house, where they could care for him properly. He couldn't work the ranch anymore, couldn't do much of anything except sit in a chair and watch the world go by. But he was surrounded by family, and that brought him comfort. On a cool autumn evening in 1923, 40 years after he'd found Rebecca in that cave, Jackson passed away in his sleep. He was 66 years old, worn out from a life fully lived. His last words, spoken to James earlier that day, were about Rebecca. "I'll see her soon now. I've missed her so much." They buried him next to Rebecca in the cemetery overlooking the ranch they'd built together. The headstone reads simply, "Jackson Ford, 1857–1923, beloved husband, father, and grandfather." Next to Rebecca's stone, which read, "Rebecca Ford, 1861–1915, beloved wife, mother, and teacher." The ranch continued under James's management, and the school Rebecca had founded kept operating for another 50 years, educating hundreds of children. Her great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren would eventually spread across the country, carrying pieces of her story with them. The story of a woman who'd survived the impossible and built a beautiful life from the ashes of tragedy. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind was just right, people said you could hear music drifting from the old Ford house, piano melodies played by ghostly hands, and laughter echoing from a porch where two souls had once sat together, watching sunsets and counting their blessings. The love story of Jackson and Rebecca Ford became part of local legend. the cowboy who found a woman in a cave and gave her back her life, and the woman who gave him a reason to stop drifting and build something lasting. It was a story of healing and hope, of second chances, and the transformative power of love. The Ford family ranch still operates today, though much reduced from its glory days. The schoolhouse Rebecca built still stands, now a museum dedicated to early education in New Mexico. And in the cemetery on the hill, two headstones stand side by side, marking the resting place of two people who found each other when they needed it most and built a love that lasted beyond death, inspiring everyone who heard their story to believe in second chances and the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds.